All right, folks, we're live. This is JWC Livestream. JWC Livestream, Joe's Writers Club Livestream, Sublimated Poesy with Ricky and David. This is a show where we bring you the contrast between poetic voice fulfillment and language play, which is at the heart of composing poetry, according to someone very wise who once told that to me. I used to be a poet. That's how I look at it now. I'm trying to rediscover myself as a poet. No small thing, apparently, and neither am I. So it makes sense. But there's still a lot to learn. Shouldn't give it up unless I have to. Just because, you know, you start getting disenchanted with something doesn't mean you can't reach back for it. As far as these transcendent forces go, anyway. Right now, I'm not working on too much poetry, but I am writing very, very poetic prose. I'm working on 2 fantasy books. Athenium, which is a fantastic mythological story. High seas adventures, but mythology too. Writing this superhuman, super normal character, Granddad Jack. It's been real fun. And I'm also writing a sci-fi book called Chiron 6. My nephew and I have been conceptualizing this world, and now I'm about halfway done with this thing. And it's very, very satisfying chapters to throw down. Creativity's been great lately that way. David Anderson, are you there, sir?
Yes, I am.
That's wonderful news. David is our resident poet extraordinaire. And he is also working on some other very, very interesting projects that we'll be hearing about, hopefully, in episodes that follow. How have you been, David? And how's your creativity going?
It's going well. I'm working on the same book that you are, Athenium.
That's true.
Also, I am in the process of outlining a novel later called Billy. And I'm writing a lot of poetry too. So it's been a very productive period for me.
That's fantastic. A wonderful position to find yourself in. Again, despite the world we live in and its uncertain nature and future, at least creativity's, the transcendent force of creativity is a gift that we can keep turning to, and it helps us get through these tough times, such as they are, whether it's foreign or domestic. So today, we have a poem wisely suggested, and it is Longfellow. It's called Haunted Houses. I plan on reading it for you. And I don't know that I'm familiar with this one, but Longfellow's great. I've read Longfellow, and people have been telling me how I need to read more, and let's see how this goes. So this is Haunted Houses. All houses wherein men have lived and died are haunted houses. Through the open doors, the harmless phantoms on their errands glide, with feet that make no sound upon the floors. We meet them at the doorway, on the stair, along the passages they come and go. Impalpable impressions on the air, a sense of something moving to and fro. There are more guests at tables than the hosts invited. The illuminated hall is thronged with quiet, inoffensive ghosts. as silent as the pictures on the wall. The stranger at my fireside cannot see the forms I see, nor hear the sounds I hear. He but perceives what is, while unto me all that has been is visible and clear. We have no title deeds to houses or lands. Owners and occupants of earlier dates, from graves forgotten stretch their dusty hands, and hold in mortmain still their old estates. The spirit world around this world of sense floats like an atmosphere, and everywhere wafts through these earthly mists and vapor dense, a vital breath of more ethereal air. Our little lives are kept in equipoise by opposite attractions and desires, the struggle of the instinct that enjoys and the more noble instinct that aspires. These perturbations, this perpetual jar of earthly wants and aspirations high come from the influence of an unseen star, an undiscovered planet in our sky. And as the moon from some dark gate of cloud throws o'er the sea a floating bridge of light, across whose trembling planks our fancies crowd into the realm of mystery and night, so from the world of spirits there descends a bridge of light, connecting it with this, o'er whose unsteady floor that sways and bends, wander our thoughts above the dark abyss. Now that is tasty. Who can't dig something like that? And it feels, it's poetry and it's a fancy for certain, but it feels as if it's informed by some sort of experience. Because I can relate to it from things that I've encountered and awarenesses that I've had. It sounds like I mean, it's beautiful poetry, but it sounds like some kind of journalism of a haunting, you know? And I mean, the poetry is delicious, comparing their silent voices to paintings and doing his very best to describe the oddities of such an atmosphere when you feel as if you're being haunted or that there's some disembodiment or something. This is, of course, if you don't believe in such things, that's fine. But if you want to write a ghost story, you got to know how that feels, how the spine tingles. I think it conveys that pretty beautifully. What do you think of that read, David? And how about this poem? You have any thoughts on this?
Yes, I do. As an agnostic, I find it interesting that Longfellow has decided to bring us into on a level that is actually not about hauntings, but more about the history of a house. So everyone is familiar with this concept of moving into a brand new house that has never been lived in before. And I think everyone can agree that there's a kind of energy and history in an old house as opposed to a new house that no one's ever lived in before.
Absolutely, yeah. And he exemplifies that here, talking about how it's ancient and how other people have lived there, and obviously
Right.
by implication died there or whatever, you know.
Right.
No,
Like there's
dig
a
it.
residual energy that's left behind whenever we are in action, whenever something has happened in that house, there's a sort of an energy that's left behind. And that seems very logical to me, that it's actually one of the most sophisticated things I've ever read on hauntings, because
Yeah,
it doesn't in a way that implies that the potential for haunting isn't just in a spirit that is creating a disturbance in a house. We can be haunted by our memories of a house. So it's not necessarily even an evil thing or a thing that is a menace to people. It can be the presence of even something as simple as a happy memory of childhood, or of a mother brushing the hair of her daughter, or a father uh, reading a book to his son. So it doesn't have to be a memory that is ill or evil in any way. So I find that interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's the very nature of what he's jabbing at by playing at it so subtly.
Yeah,
Um, because there's subtle hauntings and then there's gross hauntings. There's
right.
like something simple like what he's talking about, seeing specters on the stairs or silent voices as if you've heard something but you don't know that you did. It's subtly done, and it could be referring to recollections as opposed to anything. I mean, he drops certain words that lead me to believe that it's both. But there, and then of course, like I said, there's there's subtle hauntings, but then there's like heavy duty hauntings, like in A Christmas Carol, where you hear Marley moaning and rattling his chains.
Right.
That's about as intense as it could possibly get. So it's just plain and simple. The delicacy of this works much better.
Yes.
I wonder how you feel about that when it comes to poetry. Like poetry, you don't think poetry yields itself to like that type of a gross haunting where there's literally like a Marley. Do you or
No, not at
um
all. I mean, we have Poe, for example. Like in The Raven, there's very clearly a malevolent force that has forced itself into this man's home and is
mm,
creating a sense of dread. So there's a connection between the spirit, which is bringing a message of hopelessness. But in this Longfellow poem, it's simply histories that are reoccurring and can be sensed. So it's more about the history of a house than it is a haunting. That it
um,
that the people that lived in the house before you are still living there and they're occupying it in some small way.
yeah,
So
yeah.
so it's almost as if you are sharing the space with depending on the age of the house, you can be sharing this house with the countless generations, particularly if it's a very old house it, that's hundreds of years old. We're talking many generations of people that have passed through it and left I guess, their psychic energy. I'm, I'm actually not sure of the proper term for that. What would be the proper term for?
So psychic energy serves for our purposes.
Okay.
What because because then if you pursue an aspect like mediumhood, someone who claims to have psychic potential or psychic powers, then they would
Yes.
probably that vocabulary. So until they make a machine, and I don't mean like a laser scanner, there's laser scanners and infrared cameras and stuff that can help you detect spectral activity. But it's like, as far as mediumship and being able to not only perceive it but communicate with it, and this is for the purposes of writing this type of fiction I'm talking about. I'm not advocating one way or the other. I may have a belief of something, but that's not the point. In this particular instance, we're trying to help people with their language be able to write these circumstances.
Right.
The
Well,
concept of disembodiment, like how do you cover
yes.
something like that when you're writing a ghost story? You know, um,
Well, there is definitely a history or expectation that if you're writing about the supernatural, that it may uh, have the audience may expect that any presence or energy would be a malevolent force, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. That it could just be a you are always going to share spaces and houses or buildings or structures that have existed for a long time with people that have come before you. So you're constantly living with the history of the past. So it could be interpreted in that way, that a house has a history, and for you to be a member of that household, you are sharing that history with the house.
He made mentions of either titles or deeds or both. And
Yes, right,
concept of vital ownership versus
right.
posthumous legacy of ownership and a title record. And I know a few things about that because of my career and whatnot. But that's an interesting point behind it all. So again, there's lots to study in poetry concerning aspects of disembodiment, haunting, or recollective expo, where you're trying to breathe emotional life into a place. It's just as valid as taking life out of it by portraying death and disembodiment. Is that exercise would help you in bringing life to a place just as much, because if you could describe the absence of it, then you could focus on what it is and get that zest, clear or mystified, however you want, whatever the muse dictates on the page.
Yes.
Yeah, right on, man. So that was our poem. Unless you have anything else to cite on that, David, let me know.
No, I think we can proceed on to this short story.
Cool. So this is by Ambrose Bierce. I don't know that I've ever heard of him, which I feel I'm blushing slightly that I don't.
I can tell you a little bit about him if you're interested. He was a journalist during the Civil War period. He wrote a
Oh,
book called The Devil's Dictionary, and he wrote many story collections set in the South and during the period of the Civil War, and particularly uh, events that occurred on the battlefield. So uh, he's someone that my father introduced to me when I was very young, and he gave me a copy of the Devil's Dictionary, it's a comic dictionary. So it's a very unique kind of a book that rather than have words that are just actual definitions, it's actually a satire of a dictionary and American culture and values. So I
cool.
highly recommend that work to everyone who's listening. The Devil's Dictionary.
All right, folks, you heard it here first. I'm gonna go check it out. I'm not familiar with it. So today's reading, Ambrose Bierce. This is the Spook House. On the road leading north from Manchester in eastern Kentucky to Boonville, 20 miles away, stood in 1862 a wooden plantation house of a somewhat better quality than most of the dwellings in that region. The house was destroyed by a fire in the year following, probably by some stragglers from the retreating column of General George W. Morgan, when he was driven from Cumberland Gap to the Ohio River by General Kirby Smith. At the time of its destruction, it had 4 or 5 years been vacant. Fields about it were overgrown with brambles. The fence is gone. Even the few Negro quarters and outhouses generally fallen partly into ruin by neglect and pillage. For the Negroes and poor whites of the vicinity found in the building and fences an abundant supply of fuel, of which they availed themselves without hesitation, openly and by daylight. By daylight alone, after nightfall, no human being except passing strangers ever went near the place. It was known as the Spook House, that it was tenanted by evil spirits, visible, audible, and active. No one in that region doubted, any more than he doubted what he was told of Sundays by the traveling preacher. Its owner's opinion of the matter was unknown, and he and his family had disappeared one night No trace of them had ever been found. They left everything: household goods, clothing, provisions, the horses in the stables, the cows in the field, the Negroes in the quarters, all as it stood. Nothing was missing except a man, a woman, 3 girls, a boy, and a babe. It was not altogether surprising that a plantation where 7 human beings could be simultaneously effaced and nobody the wiser should be under some suspicion. One night in June 1859, 2 citizens of Frankfurt, Colonel J.C. MacArthur, a lawyer, and a judge, Myron Vey, of the state militia, were driving from Boonville to Manchester. Their business was so important that they had decided to push on despite the darkness and the mutterings of an approaching storm, which eventually broke upon them just as they arrived opposite the spook house. Ooh. The lightning was so incessant that they easily found their way through the gateway and into a shed where they hitched and unharnessed their team. Then they went to the house through the rain and knocked at all the doors without getting any response. Attributing this to the continuous uproar of the thunder, they pushed in one of the doors, which yielded. They entered without further ceremony and closed the door. That instant, they were in darkness and silence. Not a gleam of the lightning's unceasing blaze penetrated the windows or crevices. Not a whisper of the awful tumult without reached them there. It was as if they had suddenly been stricken blind and deaf. MacArthur afterwards said that for a moment he believed himself to have been killed by a stroke of lightning as he crossed the threshold. The rest of this adventure can be well related in his own words from the Frankfurt Advocate of August 6, 1876. When I had somewhat recovered from the day's effect of the transition from uproar to silence, my first impulse was to reopen the door which I had closed, from the knob of which I was not conscious of having removed my hand. I felt it distinctly, still in the clasp of my fingers. My notion was to ascertain by stepping again into the storm whether I had been deprived of sight and hearing. I turned the doorknob and pulled open the door. It led into another room. This apartment was suffused with a faint greenish light, the source of which I could not determine, making everything distinctly visible, though nothing was sharply defined. Everything, I say, but in truth, the only objects within the blank stone walls of that room were human corpses. In number, they were perhaps 8 or 10. It may well be understood that I did not truly count them. They were of different ages, or rather sizes, from infancy up, and of both sexes. All were prostrate on the floor, excepting one, apparently a young woman, who sat up, her back supported by an angle of the wall. A babe was clasped in the arms of another, an older woman. A half-grown lad lay face downward across the legs of a full-bearded man. 1 or 2 were nearly naked, and the hand of the young girl held the fragment of a gown which she had torn open at the breast. The bodies were in various stages of decay, all greatly shrunken in face and figure. Some were little more than skeletons. While I stood stupefied with horror by this ghastly spectacle, and still holding open the door by some unaccountable perversity, my attention was diverted from the shocking scene and concerned itself with trifles and details. Perhaps my mind, with an instinct of self-preservation, sought relief in matters which would relax its dangerous tension. Among other things, I observed that the door that I was holding open was of heavy iron plates, riveted, equidistant from one another, and from the top and bottom, 3 strong bolts protruded from the beveled edge, and I turned the knob, and they were retracted flush with the edge, released it, and they shot out. It was a spring lock. On the inside, there was no knob, nor any kind of projection, a smooth surface of iron. While noting these things with an interest and attention, which it now astonishes me to recall, I felt myself thrust aside, and Judge Vane, who, in the intensity and vicissitudes of my feelings I had altogether forgotten, pushed by me into the room. "For God's sake," I cried, "do not go in there. Let us get out of this dreadful place." He gave no heed to my entreaties, but as fearless a gentleman as lived in all the South, walked quickly to the center of the room, knelt beside one of the bodies for a closer examination, and tenderly raised its blackened and shriveled head in his hands. A strong, disagreeable odor came through the doorway, completely overpowering me. My senses reeled. I felt myself falling, and in clutching at the edge of the door for support, pushed it shut with a sharp click. I remember no more. 6 weeks later, I recovered my reason in a hotel at Manchester, whether I had been taken by strangers the next day. For all these weeks, I had suffered from a nervous fever, attended with constant delirium. I had been found lying in the road several miles away from the house, but how I had escaped from it to get there, I never knew. On recovery, or as soon as my physicians permitted me to talk, I inquired the fate of Judge Vane, whom, to quite me, I do not know, they represented as well and at home. I inquired the fate of Judge Vane, whom they represented as well as at home. No one believed a word of my story, and who can wonder? And who can imagine my grief when, arriving at my home in Frankfurt 2 months later, I learned that Judge Vane had never been heard of since that night. Ooh. I then regretted bitterly the pride which, since the first few days after the recovery of my reason, had forbidden me to repeat my discredited story and insist upon its truth. With all that afterward occurred, the examination of the house, failure to find any room corresponding to that which I have described, the attempt to have me adjudged insane, and my triumph over my accusers. Readers of the Advocates are familiar. After all these years, I am still confident that excavations which I have neither the legal right to undertake nor the wealth to make would disclose the secret of the disappearance of my unhappy friend, and possibly of the former occupants and owners of the deserted and now destroyed house. I do not despair of yet bringing about such a search. And it is a source of deep grief to me that it has been delayed by the undeserved hostility and unwise incredulity of the family and friends of the late Judge Vane. Colonel McArdle died in Frankfurt on the 13th day of December in the year 1879. And I suppose that's to mean that he never knew the absolutes. Now, that's a very, very fascinating story. It's of a similar nature, but it's a difference between the subtle and the gross haunting. This is begun with wonderful, moody prose, poetic prose, describing the house, describing the landscape, detailing the local regional history, setting the stage. And then the storm, their own hunger to get where they're going makes them reckless, and then they somehow fall into the trap of this storm, and it's very interesting to me. When you read about certain supernatural encounters, if you read about those things, either in fiction or as a matter of record, they take on familiar characteristics. It's very strange. They all have a sort of likeness to them. They don't all borrow from the same tropes, but they do have a palette that these things happen in. Like in this particular case, the weather turned, and they were forced into this house that is said to be haunted and that seems to have some sort of ill repute besides, where everybody shuns it. That weather control or weather alteration in time with stuff like that. Some people say that it may be ordained by some sort of hierarchy of spirits or by fate itself. If there's a difference between the two, that's something for the writer and the muse to parcel out. But then he walks in, and I'm assuming that he knows about this local history with this family. So a lot of people would say that perhaps he imagined it all. But phantasm, and he sees the gentleman he's with, he sees that as well, and he sees him interacting with it. So they both go into this room that's not a room because it's not supposed to be there. He reached for the doorknob to leave, and instead he's ushered into this phantasm of this dead family in a room of green mist. And they're all in various states that are, that's not what cadavers are supposed to look like. They're clearly dead, but it's much more likely that this is all some sort of spectacle being put on by some sort of malevolence, if not to convey how it feels about the death, then to scare these men away. A lot of the times in a haunted story, again, fiction or on record, there's a gross act of a phantasm that is supposed to scare the people away. Because whatever spirit dwells there does not want them. They're intruding. So these other spirits in the poem before, those are subtle. It's a subtle haunting. But this is far different. This is either the trauma that's associated with the dead family is somehow manifesting itself, or there is an entity that squats in that house. Because that's another thing, is abandoned places. Places that seem like they could be used, but they're just hanging out there. And then eventually they get forgotten. A lot of these ghost hunters, they go to abandoned places questing for such encounters purposefully. So it's just all very interesting because both of these seem to be informed by experience. If it's not personal, then it's folkloric, but it's still there. And both were marvelously written, informative to the writer, but enjoyable to the reader. David, this is a great suggestion. This story was fantastic. What did you think of the read, and what do you think of the story, man?
Well, I thought the read was very good. It has a malevolence that the poem doesn't have, so it's actually a polar. It's the other side of the coin, so to speak. So we have in the poem we have a very happy concept of what a haunting can be. It's like the history of the presence of people in spaces. But this is a force that is not accepting or tolerant of the entrance of new people into its space. So it's almost an attack on anyone who enters the space. So they're attacking anyone who comes into that house is considered an intruder.
Yes.
And they're at risk by doing so. So it's a very hostile and frightening shift from the poem to the short story.
Yeah.
And I think the various states of the corpse are actually some message from the specter, this malevolent force, about the wickedness of the people who own this property, and even the fact that slaves were owned by these people. So it's an indictment of slavery too.
Yeah, well, this all takes place on a plantation,
Right.
and
Yes.
so it's difficult to avoid, especially during the time in which it was
Exactly.
the record is capturing. I mean, that's
Right. So it's a I think that Bierce is using this spectral force as an indictment of slavery.
It could very well be. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not the state of the corpses. We don't even have corpses in the house. Actually, we don't even know if these people actually died in the house. This is actually the state of the spirit of those people that lived in that house and owned other people and were not good people. So that's how I read it. That of course,
and one witness was brought down by temporary insanity, and another witness apparently vanished from the face of the earth.
exactly. So we have the character of the judge. It's interesting that this man disappears and there's no trace of him, which almost draws the reader to believe that it's possible that the judge had some connection to these people. So there's an indictment of the South's legal system and uh, the 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 it's more evidence of the importance of how we treat each other as human beings, and that even if the law says that it's acceptable for people to own other people, then the problem is the law. And
Clearly,
yeah,
yes.
so I mean, there are a lot of levels on here that we could jump into. And I understand that it's problematic because of the language, which, not to defend Bierce, um, if someone were to write the story today, there would be a huge problem with the title of the story, first of all, because that is can be rightfully considered a very racist, pejorative language, and the fact that people are referred to with that word, which I'm not comfortable with repeating, to be completely honest. But so it's forcing. I think it's very powerful. I think it's forcing us to consider our history and to remember where we came from. So
And
it's
if you don't know, you don't know your origins, and you don't know
right,
how culture changes. How can you measure
right,
progress? And
right, exactly.
I
Yeah,
mean, obviously, these are older works. All of their terminology is antiquarian. So to find a word that is fallen out of contemporary favor, and also that has never been appetizing to anyone with moral sensibility against it.
yeah,
But the antiquarian terminology is all over these works. So it's reflecting on when they were written. Certainly no one would suggest that we should edit these documents and change them because there's words in there that make us feel yucky or whatever. I don't understand how that could be considered. So again, not favorable words, but we got to grin and bear them, you know?
well, yeah, I mean, it's a document of language at that time,
Yes,
and it's not a defense of bigotry or racial hatred in any way. I think that
certainly not.
Bierce was very anti-slavery. So I mean, he was actually
Hmm.
a Northerner and he was an abolitionist. So
Well,
at
it
the
was
time,
common terminology, you know?
yes, that was the parlance, that was the
Correct.
vernacular of the time. So we need
Correct.
to look at it through that lens.
Yeah.
But
Well, there's no other lens to view it through, you know? Um, certainly no one would suggest writing in with that vocabulary or in that mode today.
certainly
Um,
not. Yes, I
no,
agree.
but there's much that can be learned from this text, besides all of this history that we're reflecting on. Um, so that's the key, folks, is when you're writing about haunted houses, you have subtle hauntings and you have gross hauntings. You have hauntings that make you slightly uneasy. You have like a middle ground of poltergeist activity where there's like objects being moved or lost, some strange feeling, some grip on your spine that there's just something not right. And then there's a gross haunting with a terrifying phantasm of a dead family in green mist. One wiped from the face of the earth, the other witness stricken with insanity. So take your notes. Write a horror story. Write a horror poem. We're getting near the Halloweeny time, so I don't see why not. I might write one myself, because these texts we just went through, they're very inspiring. It makes me want to write horror. It makes me want to dip into horror fable and write a haunting story of a similar nature.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Ghost stories or hauntings or horror stories can give us access to an area of our humanity that we don't have in other forms of literature. So it's very justified that they can help us reveal the darkest aspects of our humanity.
Yep.
And I think of this story as being very related to the poem because we have no evidence that there was any murder that occurred in that house. We don't. This could just be the history of that house, like it was the history in the poem "The Haunted Houses," that some very wicked, evil people lived in that house, and this is the legacy that they left in that house.
Yeah, and of course, there's what paradigm are you dialing into? Like in this particular case, we're taking it verbatim that there are spirits in both, and that it's not rather some sort of hallucination brought on by either an affliction or some sort of condition that is put upon the person.
So it may lead us to ask, what is this benevolent force? Maybe that is the most important question that we need to understand about the beer story. What is the purpose of this benevolent force? What is it trying to accomplish? I would be interested to talk about that.
Well, I gave a suggestion as far as when it comes to these sort of ghost stories, that if you encounter a phantasm that's so gross and out of sight like that, like he opened a door to a place that wasn't there and he became disoriented. And then there's this menagerie of cadavers, like dead bodies, and they're long dead. And the point being, though, is that did any of that happen at all? Or did he not rather have a nervous tick that happened? Maybe his friend fell through the door, fell through the floor and into the basement and died. And he saw that and he became so neurologically perturbed that he had this hallucination that came out of his unconsciousness.
Right.
This is me playing devil's advocate, because I'm no materialist. I'm an etherealist. Like my sympathies go more with the story of a specter being it could be that it's more likely that it's a haunting, at least in my worldview. But there are many other people who would feel otherwise.
The specter is actually a force of good, actually. Then is that what you're suggesting, that the specter is what
I'm suggesting is it's the paradigm that you're decoding the situation with. If you're an etherealist and you believe in spirits, you're a spiritualist, then it's easy for you to just accept that there are ghosts in that house and that all that could happen. But if you're a materialist and you don't even believe in that sort of thing, then maybe he had a hallucination, or he hit his head, or he saw his friend fall and die, and it gave him some kind of nervous jolt. Right. And then because his condition is such where he went there with the guy, and then the guy was never seen again. So maybe this guy did die, or he wandered off. What I'm trying to get at is that there's a lot of mystery that could exist here in the interpretation.
Oh yes, I agree.
Of what's being said in the text.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to just say, well, it's a haunted story. But if we go, well, what if we apply a critical eye to it and we start to wonder, well, what really happened here? Because it is all very mysterious, like most of these things are.
Yes, and if you have take into account his fainting, it's almost like
that's what I mean. Absolutely. Yeah, he
Yeah,
was.
it's just too shocking. Like maybe he saw something and we don't have access to what he saw because
He
it
walled
was
it
just too
away.
over. Yeah, it's his brain has told him it's too it's too horrible to think or talk or speak of because
Yeah, some
the
kind of
people living
shock.
there in the community around that house um, would not go near it. So there's something very dark and sinister there in the house. So
Or at
that,
the or at the very least mysterious. And that's the thing, they would have it in their unconsciousness, like they would have heard from the people in the countryside, well, don't go over there, that's spook house, that's
yes,
very evil, the devil lives in there, that's a very evil place. And then they would be encouraged to go by it, but they well, it's, we could get struck by lightning and killed, or we can go into this shelter that's here, and
yes,
they were forced to do so. So the point
yeah,
though is that there's a condition in this story of mystery where both are acceptable circumstances.
right,
It could be that it is actually apparitions, and as I said, a phantasm, a gross one, where reality is because, and that's another trick. When they walked into the house, everything fell silent. Now
yes,
there are people that talk about this. Uh, uh, there's several terms you could call it. You could call it the silence. You could call it the Oz effect, and it usually precedes missing 411, which is a jolt of time. Those are two other colors that he painted with, because one of them goes unconscious and he wakes up in a field. So that's missing 411. Because you don't know where that time elapsed, either like foul play or physical injury or mental assault, whatever it was. Um, and like I said, all that stuff is in the records and it's in other haunted stories, but the vacuum of the senses, like it's a raging thunderstorm, thunder, lightning, pouring rain. And then as soon
yes,
as he closes the door, there's silence,
yes,
irrational silence, to the point of where he was like, this doesn't make sense. And he went back and he went to check on it. So
yes,
those are two other tropes that I would be remiss if I didn't mention, that show up not only in horror fiction, but in actual records of hauntings. It appears just like that. Now, I don't know if this is based on a real record or if this is entirely fiction, because it acts like it's the record of this Colonel McArdle or whatever. Um, but it sounds just like a real story of that
yeah.
kind.
That's
You
very
know,
plausible because as I mentioned earlier, he was a journalist and he was probably drawing some of this content from a report in the newspaper.
yep.
So it's very probable that this house had a notorious history and there was an actual house that existed that he
This
wrote
place,
about.
there's places like that all over the country.
Yes,
If you have the patience for that sort of thing to go researching, if it's a subject of interest, then you'll eat it up. But if you're like, what could this be? Just go looking. Look into the records. Some of them are like dubious, some of them are rubbish, some of them you can tell at a distance that the account is deformed by some sort of inconsistency. But this particular story holds sufficient mystery. The guy missing, the house being destroyed by fire, and all that unknown, that uncertainty, it provides a certain quality that I find very appealing in a horror story. I
yes,
don't like just to be frightened. I like to be disoriented by what I like. I like to have to like pull the cobwebs of the story aside and be like, what happened? Like, and this story is an example of that.
yes, it does
You have
hold
to kind
back.
of look.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
and
that's what I
it
mean.
really draws the reader in to use and forces them to use their imagination.
Yes, yes. And the mystery is another way of saying a thought experiment where you're supposed to decode what happened
Right.
and put it together.
I mean,
Um,
we say that it's less is more kind of approach to writing horror.
when it comes, well, and generally speaking, that's the case. But it depends, in my humble opinion, it depends on the subject. But in this particular case, we got a heavy dose of known, or at least experienced, and we got a heavy dose of unknown or unexperienced information. And the dancing of those two factors marbled perfectly in this story give it its uniqueness and its virtue, its value as a text,
So how would you contrast the wildly different approach that these two writers have to talk about haunted places?
Well, I would say, like I had mentioned before, there's a difference between a subtle haunting and a gross haunting, and there's a difference between, like, it's aligned with what are you trying to accomplish in the telling of the tale.
Yeah.
If you're trying to just be spooky, but if you're trying to jar someone, like, this isn't traumatizing to me because of my modern desensitized views and my conditioning to reading horror. But if someone read this 100 years ago, 200 years ago, this would be with them for the whole day. This might be with them for a week, because this is a dreadful tale. If that happened, if that actually happened to you, that would be horrifying.
It would, it would be something that would, upon thinking,
could change your life, right?
Yes, I agree completely. So
So whereas the haunting of the poem it's more of a curiosity. It's not a consciousness altering horror, because it's subtle enough where you can shrug it off and you can say, well, I just don't believe in that sort of thing and whatever, but in this particular case, when you're writing horror like this, you should use the blending of both. First, it's the subtle tricks, then leaning into poltergeist activity, and then it's and then a gross haunting, like this monstrous phantasm leading into madness. It's like anything Lovecraft served up, like the Haunter in the Dark, or the Haunter of the Darkness. I can never get the damn title of that story right. But that one has a bit of both. It has subtle atmosphere and it has gross, traumatizing atmosphere, both in the same story.
Yes, so, because it's built up to that room where suddenly they find these corpses, and it's just that would be terrifying. I know I would be horrified by that sight.
That's my point, is like, people pay good money to see that stuff in a haunted house or something, like an attraction.
Right.
But it's like, if you actually walked into a place and that was waiting for you unannounced, I don't know how you're going to be cool with that. Like, randomly for no reason at all. You're all of a sudden in a room with bodies, and it's like, what is this? Like, what am I even looking at? And then, so anyway, this has been a great show. I really enjoy this show on Mondays. Guys, we have JWC Livestream. This is JWC Livestream, Sublimated Poesy with Ricky and David, where we talk about poetic voice fulfillment versus the language play that exists in poetry alone. We're trying to help you write better prose, more poetic prose, different prose, more detailed, perhaps more flowery. So we're showing you content to that end. We've been hitting the Halloweeny spirit with this spooky stuff. That's not all we're about. We're going to keep going as long as possible. Bringing the transcendental force of creativity to you Mondays and Thursdays. Please do go to joeswritersclub.com. Sign up at joeswriters.club. And furthermore, head to our social media, Facebook, Twitter. Please go to our YouTube page, like and subscribe, and let us know what you think about our show in the comments. And thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you, David, for being on the program. I had a blast, man. And thanks, everyone. Oh, is that you?
Hello. Sorry.
It is Tom. Hello, Tom. How are you doing?
Good. I didn't mean to jump in right at the last 3 seconds.
Oh, no, you're always welcome. Okay.
All right. Well, Tom's here. We're going to chat, guys. If you want to go join us, head over to joeswriters.club. If you don't, I understand. But take care. Say bye-bye, everyone. We're signing off.
Bye-bye.